The village pond looks like any other village pond in England, except there's no wildlife there. There are no ducks. It's eerily empty.
The feeling is very much as though all of the citizens of this village have just been made to disappear at a stroke.
Further on, the strangeness continues. A few hundred yards from the village green is a school that looks perfectly preserved.
The desks are still there. The books are still there. It's laid out as if the children had only been there yesterday. There are still pegs with their names on out in the corridor. It feels as if it's a school that's still being used, but from another age.
You get the feeling that it's break time and the children have just gone through the door and are running about outside playing.
The church, too, is in perfect condition. The rows of seats freshly polished, and the stained glass windows as immaculate as when they were first installed. And that's not all.
In the middle of the village, there's an old white telephone box, which seems something of an oddity in this day and age. And even more odd is the local story that even though it was disconnected decades ago, it still rings.
Other buildings hint at a darker narrative, like the cottages, which are little more than empty shells.
And these are in an unusual state of disrepair. The roofs have gone, the fittings have gone, the windows have gone, but yet at the same time, these wrecks, these husks, have been strengthened.
It's almost as though somebody is about to film a movie about 1930s England.
Why on earth are these buildings like this? How can you have a little schoolroom that looks intact, a church that looks intact, but a lot of ruined cottages?
So what calamity has happened to leave this village so completely abandoned? To find out what's behind the mystery, you need to go back to a single day that would change the course of the Second World War.
In 1943, Britain was at war. To win, the Allies had to invade France and liberate northwest Europe from Nazi control.
Codenamed Operation Overlord, it would be the largest seaborne invasion in history if they could train enough troops in time to drive out the Germans.
It was a daunting prospect for the British Army. They had to train vast numbers of recruits, many of whom hadn't seen combat before, and they needed space and terrain and environments that were fitting and that were like what they were going to face when they arrived in France.
But what does this have to do with a small and isolated village in rural England, which seems a world away from the dull thud of gunfire and chaos of war?
By 1943, the south coast of England had been transformed into an armed camp. 11 million acres, much of it farmland, became airfields, camps and training grounds.
And more land was needed, especially to train British and American tank crews.
If you're training people to operate tanks, it's not enough to just learn how to drive it. The really key thing is learning how to shoot it. So you need long distances to practice firing those shells where you're not going to hit anything you don't want to hit.
And this location was ideal. It was remote and already close to a firing range. The village of Tyneham.
The only stumbling block was that 200 people lived in the village. How do you tell them they need to leave their homes, their jobs, and their neighbors for good?
Linda Price, a local historian, has spoken to many of the former residents.
The final blow came in November 1943, and totally out of the blue, they all got a letter. They came from a gentleman from Southern Command, and on it he said that the area was needed for military training, and they had basically a month to get out.
It must have been heartbreaking. These were people who lived in this village for generations, and all of a sudden to be uprooted and told that you have to leave, and they expected to come back. You know, that's what's very poignant about it. They thought the war would end, they would come back, and all would be as it was.
So why did the Ministry of Defense choose Tyneham?
Tyneham was a backwater in a backwater. I mean, it was practically off the map. They didn't have electricity. Most of them didn't even have indoor plumbing. People forget how primitive the English countryside could be back in that era.
They lived in little cottages, most of which were owned by the landowner. In fact, the whole estate was owned by the Bond family, and most of these people, their lives would have been tied into the bonds.
So in some senses, it was already a way of life that was passing, or perhaps for most people, even past.
The army knew that the church was vulnerable to attack in the run-up to D-Day. They removed the heavy oak pulpit and the pews and carefully transported the stained glass to a place of safety.
Even if Tyneham was abandoned, it hadn't been completely forgotten. But was the villagers' sacrifice worth it? The U.S. Army had adopted the area, and their men and machines were about to invade Omaha Beach.
The morning of the 6th of June 1944 was like no other the war had ever seen. Over 150,000 English, American, Canadian and other soldiers boarded ships, vessels, barges of all descriptions and attacked the French coast. By the time the battle there was over and the forces were able to push down into France, the course of the war had been changed forever.
D-Day was a resounding success, but the villagers weren't the only ones who'd made sacrifices. 2,500 US troops, many of whom had trained at Tyneham, lost their lives on Omaha Beach.
Even after the war, Tyneham continued to be a vital training ground for tank crews. So the villagers were never allowed back. However, when the guns stop firing, the village opens to visitors.
When I look at Tyneham, what I think about is how much dislocation, how much destruction, what a human cost there is, even to winning a war, even to non-combatants. The level of self-sacrifice that was necessary to conduct the kind of total war that was required to defeat the Nazis, that kind of effort boggles the modern mind.